It's my last night in Australia. I've been here for 3 weeks. I just had dinner with 2 influencers who I've known for several years, but I made a special flight to Byron Bay to see them. Also, I got picked up at the airport from 2 incredible women who I've also known for, I guess, a couple years now. They had me on their incredible summit, and they were at the airport to pick me up. And I think back to the very first time I met this upcoming guest, Larry. We were at an exchange event, John Berghoff's event, and just instantly deeply connected. Had each other on each other's podcasts, very similar to the people that I had dinner with tonight. We just instantly dropped in. As I think forward into this podcast you're about to watch, the vulnerability, the bravery of Larry, the last year that he's had, he kind of has these, in my estimation, these quantum leaps. He'll go within, have a really difficult time, but he does the work. He integrates his shit, and then the universe goes, okay, he's serious, and then he goes to this next level. I want you to watch both part 1 and part 2. We get very much into the story of how he wrote his book and the lessons he went through. Very similar to the dinner conversation I was having this evening with my colleagues. It's we're terrified, we do it anyways. We don't know what the hell's going to happen, we do it anyways. We put aside our point of view, our egos, we show up anyways. It's we give our life to the divine. Have your way with us. You're going to love this part 1, but definitely watch part 1 and part 2, because I get to know a spiritual side of Larry that, I've known him for years and years, respect him so deeply, him and Jess and the boys. But this, every time we go deeper, and this time we went even deeper. Enjoy. Welcome to Intimate Conversations. Become the one. Intimacy is an inside job. Hello, delicious people. I'm so excited to be with you again for a return guest, my dear friend, brother from another mother, Larry Hagner. Here we are in August of Become the One is our theme for season 12. And this month we're talking about from head to heart. Larry has one of the biggest hearts I know. And we're going to be talking about what if beliefs are actually made up. He's got a new book that I want you to know about as well, The Spirit of Fatherhood. In the show notes, you're also going to learn about 25 intimate conversation starters that you can find on his site, thedadedge.com. But let me tell you more about this incredible man, and then we'll get away to the races. So in 2015, Larry decided to start the Dad Edge podcast and learn the skills from experts to live a legendary life as a husband, father, and man. And over the past 8 years, he has interviewed over 1,000 experts on parenting, mindset, patience, communication, intimacy, optimizing health, and the power of community. And the Dad Edge podcast has been the #1 dad podcast for 5 years running, with over 30 million downloads to date. And Larry is the proud father of 4 energetic boys who he's taking on a cruise so they can feed them rather than Jess. And he's the husband of his soulmate, Jessica, for the past 20 years. Life isn't all sunshine and rainbows every day. However, he learned the skills to optimize his life as a man, husband, and father. And if you're a lifelong learner and you don't have this thing figured out yet, none of us really do, join Larry and continue to learn together and live legendary. So first, just thinking back to the very first time I met you, John Berghoff's event, the exchange approach, and it's been several years. Yeah. And I just remember right away, Larry, we just went deep fast. You have the capacity to see, but also have the capacity to be seen. And that was allowed us to connect as brother, sister, transparently, vulnerably, and support each other ever since. So it's wonderful to see you.
Back at you. It's so good to see you. It's always good to I always feel so much tremendous energy every time we're together. So I just love being in your environment. It's always heartfelt. It's always good.
Thank you, love. Thank you. So, since we talked last, you have launched your book, The Spirit of Fatherhood, which is like a fifth child. I mean, it's such a journey to put down all of your wisdom into a book. So I want to start there. Like, how was that for you?
It was really interesting. I've never had so this is my fourth book and I've never had actually it's my fifth. I have another book I already wrote, which actually got me this opportunity to write The Spirit of Fatherhood, which was really fascinating. But the journey of writing this book was really, really interesting
Tell
and
me.
really, really hard.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and I think sometimes the story of me writing the book is somewhat, I would say, more fascinating than even the book itself. But
mm,
yeah, so it all started back actually in September 2022. I finished a book called The Pursuit of Legendary Fatherhood.
yeah.
And that was like going to be like the big book, right? Like the book that and it still is. It's like it's the one book that I poured everything into it, like that we've learned over the past decade about
Mm,
fatherhood, everything you talked about in the intro, like all of these things, our health, our leadership, our mindset, our patience, our calm, our connection with our wives, intimacy, asking questions, dating our wives again, like all of these
mm,
things and so much more. So it literally went into that book. And I had a publisher and everything for that
mhm.
book, and then I found out 6 weeks before pub date, my publisher was going bankrupt, and I was like, yeah, I was like, wow, this is crazy. I was like, so I met with the CEO, and I was
Yeah.
like, so what do we do? And he's like, well, he's like, I can either help you self publish Pursuit of Legendary Fatherhood, or I just sign the rights to your book back over to you. And I was like, I'll take that.
Mm,
So I hired an agent,
mhm.
and she's been in the literary space, and I was told like by other agents. They're like, if Marilyn gives you a thumbs up because she's been in the business for 40 years, she used to work for HarperCollins as literary agent, then you got a good book. So
Nice.
I met with her and she's like, I'll read your book and tell you what I think. And she called me right back in a few days and she's like, oh my gosh, I love this book. She's like, I'd love to rep it. I'm like, okay, awesome. So she went started shopping the book and we had several publishers that had meetings with us. We couldn't really land on an agreement that we thought was fair or mutual win-win. And then we met with Morehouse. And Morehouse, it was a fascinating call because they're just like, yeah, so we love your book, but
Mhm.
we don't want to publish that book just yet. And I'm like, it's like, okay, then why are we talking? Right.
Yeah, exactly right.
And they're like, well, we want you to write a different book. And I'm like, okay. I was like, and they're like, we want you to write a book called The Spirit of Fatherhood. And I was like, The Spirit of Fatherhood. I was like, okay. I was like, well, what's that about? And they're like, we want you to write a faith-based, like heart-centric, faith-based approach to fatherhood and marriage and everything you've learned. And I laughed. I laughed at him. I was like, that's hilarious. I was like, you guys got the wrong guy. I was like, I'm new to my faith. I was like, I've been a practicing faith-based person my whole life, but I'm only been like really understanding it and have a relationship with God now for ever since 2020. I was like before that, like I was like I'm still trying to figure this out. Like that was
Yeah.
and they laughed and like we know we've been watching you for a while and that's why we want you to write it.
Wow.
And I was like really? And they're like yeah, they're like we just think you have this approach and relativity about you like that you're still learning. And I think that if you wrote the book in that way, that you're
Mm,
still learning this stuff and
yeah.
versus like, teaching, I think we got something. And I was like, I can do that.
Wow.
So, so I just simply asked them, I said, well, when do you guys need this by? And they're like, well, we want to launch it by Father's Day. And this was August of last year. And I was like, okay, so I have like 6 months. And they're like, no, you actually have 11 weeks to write this book. And I was like, 11 weeks? I was like,
What?
11 weeks? And they're like, yeah, we need it done by November 1st because like editing and marketing and you'll be a part of what we call the summer release. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, I don't know if I can do that. So I met with my agent and I was like, what do you think? And she's like, what do you think? Like, what does your
Mm,
heart tell you? And
yeah.
I'm like, I think I should say yes to it. She goes, I do too. And I was like, okay. She goes, even though you think it's impossible, like, I think you can do it. So
Wow.
I said yes to it.
Yeah.
And like I said, the interesting thing about writing that book is when you're writing about that topic, and it wasn't like the entire book wasn't all about that, but it was sprinkled in there heavily, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I had some spiritual mentors in my life. They're like, watch your back. And they would like smile, like, watch your back. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, oh, the lightning will hit the tallest tree in the forest. And when you do something like this, when you write something and you've got an audience, the size of yours, the enemy is going to take that as a threat and he's going to mess with you. And I'm like, what do you mean? They're
Yeah.
like, spiritual warfare, man, spiritual warfare. And I'm like,
Bring
okay.
it. Bring it. I got shivers, Larry. Oh my God. Yeah.
It got bad. And as soon as I
Mm.
inked that contract, suddenly like dominoes started to fall. Like the death of what my wife and I would call the death of 1,000 cuts started to happen. So
Wow.
like 4 days after I inked that contract, our 4-year-old dog out of nowhere, perfectly healthy, huge Great Dane mix, 160-pound dog, our beloved, wonderful, like the boys just love this dog.
Mm.
Suddenly comes down with end stage lymphoma. And we took him to the vet like 4 days and they're like, your dog, we're like, we don't have to tell you this, but your dog has 2 weeks to live. And we're like, what? Like he's 4. He's not acting like
Yeah.
he's a little slow, but they're like, no, he's really, really, really sick.
Oh
And we
dear.
were like, you got to be kidding me. And sure enough, 6 days later, he died.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It was just like, whoa.
Wow.
Then um, I'm doing a workout with my oldest son and I completely bust my knee.
Oh, that's when you
And
busted your knee. Got it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. Yeah.
right after the first week. And for anybody who knows me, like fitness is my therapy, it is my
Totally.
outlet.
Yep.
It's quite frankly, it's dangerously probably too much of my identity, to be honest. But like
Mm, mm.
that's where I go to reduce my stress and have my outlet, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so I found out like 8 weeks after this injury, as I'm writing this book, I can barely walk, I can barely drive, I can't go up and down stairs anymore. I'm on crutches. And that's when I finally go to the doctor like an idiot. Come to find out for 8 straight weeks, my knee had been bleeding internally in the
Mm,
leg.
mm, mm, mm.
And so it was serious. I was like, I thought it was swelling, but I couldn't get the swelling to go down. And then finally, like, they're like, you actually have blood in your knee. Like, that's not good. Like, something's really, really wrong in there. And the doctors were telling me they couldn't find any tears in the ligaments. And so then I'm being tested for blood disorders and
Mm.
cancer and bone cancer. And, you know,
Jesus.
oh, it gets worse. Like, they're telling me, they're like, if we can't get this bleeding to stop, a lot of people like have to get their leg amputated because
I
they
was
can't
gonna
get.
say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh, and I'm like trying to write this book the whole time. While
Yep.
I'm doing that, the family is just getting attacks from all ends, right? So my 16-year-old has a horrific, um, tackle on the football field, and his entire life is he wants a D1 scholarship. He plays football, like that's his whole life. No drugs, no alcohol, all about good grades in football. And
Yep.
he almost had a career-ending injury. Like we were
Mm,
terrified.
mm,
My
mm,
um my oldest had a bunch of stuff that happened to him within our organization. I had my COO just up and resign out of nowhere, which was a blessing in disguise. He really wasn't working that hard.
mm.
But like he left us with a horrific amount of loose ends. And so my team's a mess. I'm a mess. Family's getting attacked. But I still somehow wrote that book and I wrote it and I finished it 9 days early. But here's what I'll tell you. I think that I was very, very, very bitter. Like I actually went through a horrible depression, like
Mm.
while I was writing that book.
I remember. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would actually say only probably a few months back is when I first finally fully came out of it. But like I think what was happening was I remember getting that book deal and sitting down, and this was before all this stuff happened, and I looked at a blank screen and I'm like, I'm not the guy to write this book. I'm
Mm.
just I can't write it. There's nothing in me. Like I don't know what to say. I don't know what the words are. And what I found was as soon as I got hurt and all these horrific things happened, I would sit down and suddenly it became the easiest book I ever wrote. And the
Totally.
only thing that I can actually identify that happened
Mm.
is that there was good and evil, powers of good and evil that were working for me and totally against me at the same time writing this book. But what it did was is it stripped me down like completely emotionally, mentally
Mhm.
just naked, right? Like
Yep.
all like, you know, the high levels of fitness and the great things happening in the organization and the great things happening in my family and all this stuff, like all of it was horrifically going away.
Yep.
And
Yep.
what I found is that I think that that's what was supposed to happen, because I
100%.
couldn't write that book from the place that I began with. And it took
Mm.
like stripping down and writing
Yeah.
that book from that most authentic and vulnerable place possible.
Yeah. You had ego death after ego death after ego death.
It's about the best way. Yeah, that's the best way I could describe it.
Yeah. I 100% get it. Wow. Wow. Not that I get what it's like to be you, but remember last interview we did? You had no idea what I went through since the last interview we had
Yeah.
when company went away, criminal assault, ex-boyfriend, lost the company, didn't know where to live, all those like, still haven't talked to Gabriel. So a similar thing happened where I believe the next level of being of service is we have to be emptied out of our ego so that we can be a vessel for the divine to use us.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh,
And if we still are identified with our fitness, our money, our company, or our relationship, our children, if we're still identified, if our worth is still outside in anywhere, if our safety is outside in anywhere, right? If our sense of belonging is outside in anywhere, we're not fully empty to have God use us. And I so respect you that you went through that fire. There's a fire, like a phoenix rising out of a ego death after ego death fire. Wow. And I get that it was easy to write. That part I'd like you to go deeper into, because when my ego writes a book, or I have an attachment to the result, or I want to look good, or I don't want to fail, or I don't want to be rejected, or I want this to help my career, if I have any attachment, I'm fucked, because the ego is writing the book, not my heart, my soul, not the divine. At my last retreat in Costa Rica for the intimacy group, one of the questions, day 2, how does the divine ache to know itself as you? But you can't hear that. You can't be that. You can't write the book. God's using your hand to write the book unless your ego's been annihilated. So I respect you. I've always respected you, but even more now. Tell us more about why you believe it was easiest to let that creativity pour through you.
I think it was, I think you nailed it. I've never really been able to describe it because I was so stressed out. I was so overwhelmed. I was so defeated that when I was outside of writing that book, that's all I could kind of focus on was all those things. But when I wrote the book, to be honest, I think it gives hope,
Mm,
right, to somebody who might be in that place, right? And the book is not doom and gloom. Don't take me wrong, but like the book is all about hope in its simplest form, right? And the things
mm,
that we can do as men, husbands, and fathers, to even when the fact that we feel completely empty and there's nothing
mm,
left, right?
mm, mm,
All the way to the point where we feel like we can give and give and give and everything in between. But the way that I wrote that book came like from that place of really like taking a man for a journey.
mm,
And the whole book starts out with like, what a guy is saying to himself and feeling and what's in his mind as his wife's in delivery. Like that's how the whole book starts.
mm.
And it's all these fears and it's all these things of like, you talk about death of ego. You're like, oh my gosh, like what am I about ready to step into here? Like this
Yeah.
is like the unknown of the unknown of the unknown. And the stakes are so high that I can't screw it up. And like all these things that we're saying. And like right out of the gate, the very first chapter is all about addressing those fears, head on, that the fact that number one, let's normalize all of them.
Mm.
Right. If you're worried about your marriage going away because your kid's coming, well, guess what? Join the club. Everybody else is saying that, but they're not saying it out loud.
Yeah, totally.
How you're going to provide financially, like, are you enough? Are you going to be enough? Are you going to make enough? Like all these things that you're so worried about, right? Like, the answer to those questions are in there too. The fact that like, well, what if I'm not the most patient father? I can't teach this kid, everything. Then am I less than? And the answers to those is in there too. Right. So, but I do have a really interesting story. There were several really crazy experiences that happened. One of them was insanely meaningful.
Mm,
And this goes to like how you and I were trained, like really great questions, right? So like my oldest and I one night, um, we were going back and forth and we were saying like, hey, you can ask me anything. Like, let's play ask me anything, right?
mm,
And so my son, I'm sitting there out on the deck, and this is right before I had surgery, and I was right in the heat of the doctors testing me for bone cancer and like why they couldn't get this bleeding to stop. And like, you know, like, do I have a blood disorder? And like, is my leg going to be taken? Like I was in such the pit that I couldn't even see straight. I mean, I broke down privately more probably in the past 6 to 7 months than I probably have in 10 years, just
Mm,
thinking like the worst. And then also trying to like recover like a lot of the things, not just my knee, but a lot of things that were really bad.
mm,
And so one night, you know, my son asked me, he goes, I want to ask you a question. I said, sure. And he goes, what do you admire about me most? What do you admire about me the most? And I'm like, wow. I was like, well, that's such a good question. And I
mm,
looked at him and I said, you know, I said, there's so many things. I was like, but I think I admire like your curiosity. Like I admire
mm.
you're curious about everything and you ask questions about everything and you're so curious about life. And I was like, you're so curious about your faith. I was like, you know, the fact that you're so curious about your faith and you practice your faith, that was like the last thing on my list when I was 18 years old.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I just love the fact that you're so curious about these things and you chase
Mm,
them down. And then I excused myself from the conversation because the only thing that would bring me relief is if I would lay flat on my back in my bed and, you know, prop up my leg. And so I'm sitting there and I'm reading through, you know, Dr. Google about like all these horrific things that are going to happen if they can't get the bleeding to stop. And I just started to cry.
mm,
And my son came in and he's like, hey, are you, are you crying?
mm,
And I was like, no, I was like, I'm fine. You know, cause it's like my go-to, right? I'm like, no, I'm fine. And
mm,
he's like, he goes, you are crying. And I'm like, and I wrote about this in the book. I go, yeah, I go, Ethan, I am. I go, I'm scared, man. I'm really, really scared. I
mm,
go, I don't know what's going to happen here.
mm.
And I was like, they're testing me for all these things. They're saying that they might have to amputate my leg, like if they can get this bleeding to stop. Like my head's a mess. And he goes, do you mind if I pray for you? And I'm like, and I was like, really? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I like, and I'm laying there. I want you to get the visual. I'm laying on my back. He's sitting on the edge of my bed. And I was, everything in me, all that ego wanted to say, no, I'm good. You don't have to do that. Right. But I was like, there was something in me that was just like, you know, don't take this from him. So I was like, yes, I'd like that. And I felt at first, I was like, this is so weak. I can't believe my kid is having
Yeah.
to pray over me. Right. And I'm looking up at him and the coolest thing happened. Like I literally felt like there was another presence in that room.
Of course there
Like,
would.
and the words that my son were speaking, like the thing that I got were these are not just his own. And he just like closed his eyes and these words just poured
Mm,
out. And it was like the best gift of peace I could have ever asked for in that moment. But the coolest thing was this. He opens his eyes back up. And at this point, now I'm really a mess. And I'm like, oh my God. And he's like, he goes, well, what? And I go, that was the coolest thing I think I've ever seen, I've ever experienced. And I go, you know what else was really cool? I was like, not only did I feel like there was more here than you and I was like, but I feel so honored right now because I got to see something that I don't think a lot of dads get to see. And he's like, what's that? I go, I got to see in the first person what your kid is going to experience, you as a dad.
oh,
And that was like to see, to be like that little kid who's in that bed and that dad who's beside you and pouring words into you. I got to see like, this is how he's going to operate as a father. And I am experiencing this almost from a child's perspective. And I was so unbelievably moved by that. That was a gift that came out of just writing that book that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So it was really cool.
I'm so grateful that we've reconnected and you're sharing this with us. See you next week on Intimate Conversations. Get out there and make love to life. Okay, it's my last day in Australia after 3 weeks. This is Byron Bay where I'm waking up. But before that, Hopefully it's not too windy. But before that, I was up at 4:15 a.m. to start my first coaching. I'm always a coach and coached. I think it's important for me to always have somebody that sees my blind spots as I see other people's blind spots. So I was up on my coaching call this morning. It started at 5 a.m. Oh, just the depth of practice that I'm looking for to help me be a better practitioner, a better conscious leader with my amazing clients. And so I was crying, I was laughing. I've had way too much caffeine already this morning, so I'm gonna go for my last walk and then head to the airport. And I think my flight is a 2 or 3 hour flight, and then like a 16-hour flight, and then another like 3-hour flight. Anyways, it's gonna be a journey. But as you watched with part 1 of Larry, it's a journey. We sign up for things in life, especially with his book that he was asked to write, but then they wanted him to write something else. Like, show up and then see what life has in order. Like, if we don't even get on the playing field, we just stay spinning in our head. So I so respect Larry. I respect his presence. I respect his willingness to surrender. I respect his willingness to go, I am not the person to write this book. But in so doing, he became the person to write that book. You're going to love part 2. Please follow Larry if you don't already. If you're a dad looking for a community, I don't know when you're going to get this podcast, but he also has an event coming up in October, I believe, in Florida. Anyways, I trust this man. I respect this man. Enjoy having him in your world. And if some of the things that I was sharing as well regarding, oh my God, softening my body, oh my God, opening my heart, oh my God, letting go of the past, oh my God, being authentic, oh my God, finally having that depth of intimate connection with myself and another is what's going to support your marriage, your relationship with yourself. Please reach out. There is nothing more nourishing than being home in your body. Everything from the past being integrated into your wisdom and superpowers in the present moment, while always still being a student, while never quote unquote getting there, but being willing to no longer have those things that stop you. You're in charge. You're absolutely in charge of your life. Thank you for being with us on Intimate Conversations. Off I go for my last walk along the beach.